All right, AP Euro lecture number 4, the end of the Cold War. Let's run through what happens. So Russia had been expanding its territory and power for 300 years. Ever since the Romanovs took power in 1613, a couple decades later, they start conquering their neighbors, expanding their territory, and becoming a behemoth, the world's largest country, and then one of the world's wealthiest countries. Slowing that momentum for a decade or so is pretty unusual and unexpected. The United States was not expecting the Soviet Union to fall apart. We didn't realize it was happening because they did such a good job with conspiracy and controlling the media that even we weren't quite aware of the details. A lot of what we talk about the Soviet Union we now know because after the collapse in 1991, we can send scholars in there to do research and actually look at primary sources and understand what's happening. But a lot of that is going to be disputed. So, until then at least. So the end of the Cold War. Number one, for several decades we had tried really conservative, mediocre leadership. We did not want people to make any changes. When I say conservative, I don't mean on political spectrum conservative. I mean like they don't want to do anything to rock the boat. They want to keep everything as it is. They do not want to try to innovate or modernize. This is what happens when you have two leaders in a row who are appointed after Brezhnev who are literally terminally ill within a couple months of taking office, and they were already kind of sort of sick when we appointed them. So we don't want anybody to make changes for years. The era of stagnation under Brezhnev. Number two, we see the rise of Islamism on their border, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Afghanistan, also a Muslim state that is creating a minority trying to overthrow the communist-supported government of Afghanistan. The areas that Iran and Afghanistan border the Soviet Union are in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. Those are all areas, Kazakhstan, that are heavily Muslim. The Soviet Union, as a communist state's official policy of religion is atheistic. And of course, we often think of the Russian Orthodox Church, but there's a huge population of millions of Muslims as well. And so the Soviets are concerned about Islamism and a more conservative version of that religion spilling into their country and causing more revolts. So it is decided preemptively in December 1979 to invade Afghanistan. This will turn out to be a disaster akin to America's invasion of Vietnam. You are facing an enemy that has got difficult terrain. Of course, in the United States, it's the jungles of Vietnam. In the Soviet Union, it's the terrain of Afghanistan, known as the Graveyard of Empire. 19th century Britain, the greatest empire that's ever existed, could not conquer the Afghanis. So, there's huge mountains, 15,000 feet tall. There's valleys. There's lots of places to hide. There's desert. It's a very formidable place. Excuse me, very tribal in nature as well. So, it's a long slog. We get bogged down. What is our purpose? It's kind of like the United States has a vague mission in Vietnam. We see a vague mission in the Soviet Union military for Afghanistan. Plus, why are we fighting? What is our purpose? And the Afghanis are literally fighting for their lives, for their freedom, for their livelihood. And so it's a very different purpose, and they get to struggle. Also, the United States will help support the Afghanis, the religious conservatives, Mujahideen, with famously shoulder-based rocket launchers, which are used to bring down Soviet helicopters and bring some equality to the fight. So in 1987, the Soviets will pull out, having lost thousands of men, billions of dollars, and no victory whatsoever. It's an embarrassment. It's a shame. It helps hasten the end of that empire. Number three, the increasing economic comparison with the West and the Chinese. Of course, as we get into the 1980s, we start having satellite television. The United States has been broadcasting what's called Radio-Free Europe into Eastern Europe in local languages for a couple decades now. And so it is becoming increasingly obvious to Soviet citizens that their society and their perception of the West are not true. That what they had thought was their superiority is actually not as accurate. As we smuggle more Western music and goods into that country, we have limitations on culture. And so the Soviet citizens want to have the opportunities the West has. The same is also true for China. China liberalizes her economy in the late 1970s while staying a dictatorship. They liberalized their economy. So today, China is one of the world's greatest economies, number 2 behind the United States in total volume of economy. And that starts happening in the late 70s. By the late 80s, these guys were communists like us, and now look at them kicking butt, and ours is on the decline. And that's a problem for the government. Number 4, Reagan is going to open up the checkbook and start spending billions and billions of dollars against the Soviet Union. The Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, space lasers to knock down nukes. The Soviets have to develop their own program. Except, of course, it doesn't work. We never get it optional or operational, but they spend billions trying to keep up. And that's going to help hasten their downfall as well. And then lastly, Gorbachev wants to try to modernize his country and save it before it's too late. The problem is it's like a dog that wants to have the window open on a hot day in the car. You give a little bit of breeze, instead of being satisfied, what does the dog want? The dog wants to stick its entire face out the window. When you start giving these people in the Soviet Union a little bit of freedom, a little bit of opportunity, they're not satisfied, and so thank you for a little bit of freedom. They want more. And so we will see a demand for more, which will lead to revolution. So again, they are three. A, glasnost, openness. This is going to be media relations, a freedom of the press, asking questions. Some local elections where people can participate, like city council kind of things. Now, this is the same time in 1985 when we're in Afghanistan and it's going poorly. Think 1972 in Vietnam for the United States. And so a lot of this new freedom of the press is going to be researching what's happening in Afghanistan. Why are our leaders doing this? And it's going to look really bad on them, what is occurring in Afghanistan. B, perestroika, restructuring. This is restructuring the economy a little bit, aka allowing a little bit of capitalism, kind of what Lenin did with the NEP back in 1921. So we're going to allow some private businesses. It's a little too late. It doesn't solve much, but it hastens people that want to have that opportunity. Man, this is great. If only we'd had more of this. And why we even keep the rest of the system at all? There's no purpose to it. We opened up the first McDonald's in Moscow in 1987. We started allowing some Western artists to tour there and perform concerts, for example, there in the 1980s. So we allow a little bit of openness in terms of the media and in terms of a little tiny bit of democracy at the local level. And we allow there to be a diet part of capitalism injected into our economy. And these things, instead of kind of making people satisfied, they make them want more change, and they eventually hasten the end. Now, probably the biggest thing that's going to happen, outside of just the economy collapsing, is in the summer of 1989, Gorbachev publicly announces, we will no longer enforce the Brezhnev Doctrine. We will no longer invade Eastern European countries to put an end to their democratic movements. Again, many of our Poles and our Hungarians and our Czechs were not afraid of their own governments as much. They were afraid of the Soviets. Now that that threat is gone, it's on for independence season. So we start seeing some of the protests in the summer of '89. We start seeing people try to make a run for it and cross borders. We start seeing people try to get into embassies of Western countries in Eastern European nations, because once you're in an embassy, that is foreign territory. The police of that nation cannot interfere. So people are trying to get the heck out of the Iron Curtain. The best example of this happens in November of 1989 with the Berlin Wall. I have a short YouTube clip I'm going to put up that I'd like you guys to watch about what happens. It was filmed and edited with a commentary by a man who was living in Berlin at the time who describes it. It actually, the Berlin Wall opens up when it does by accident. A guy misread his PR statement and said the wrong thing, and leads to absolute chaos at the border. And then we will quickly see things change from there. Germany reunifies in 1990. And the Soviet Union itself will collapse in 1991. Now, of all the revolutions in Eastern Europe in 1989-90, only one is violent. That is Romania. Romania had a hardcore dictator for 25, 30 years named Nicolae Ceausescu. He and his wife were brutal. They killed people, secret police, all that classic Stalin stuff, which had fallen out of favor after Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. And he is going to be arrested. He and his wife both tried and executed within a couple weeks. There's a great YouTube clip of him giving a speech in Bucharest, the capital, where he's clearly confused because people start to boo him. And he just doesn't know how to handle it because, of course, he's only gotten fake applause for 30-some years because everybody's terrified of him, and now they're not. So that's the only violent revolution. The rest of them end peacefully. We will see the Velvet Divorce, where the Czech Republic and Slovakia end up as independent nations. We see Poland have elections in 1989. So this happens pretty quickly. And then again, Germany reunifying in 1990. So all of this happens rather readily. Your parents were alive when this happened, many of them. Your grandparents definitely were. Feel free to ask some questions about what they remember. I was 10. I just turned 11 when the Berlin Wall fell, and I didn't know much about it, but I remember seeing it on the nightly news when I was a kid. We watched that as a family and kind of seeing a little bit of what occurred at that time. So I have vague recollections of the Berlin Wall falling in 1989. So that's the end of the Cold War lecture. I have one more left in our series. Thanks.